the cloud. All right, and we are recording. So Rufus, why don't you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for participating. So I'm Rufus Pollock, and I'm an economist, and I'm also a kind of advocate for a digital age that works for everyone. And in that context, I've written the book, The Open Revolution: Rewriting the Rules of the Information Age. And I'm also the founder in that context of Open Knowledge Foundation, which is a global nonprofit which is advocating for, exactly that in a sense, an information that works for everyone.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, I am very excited to dive into our Q&A about this book. And I know that usually these things start with what's the book about? And we will get into that, I swear we will. But I think that it's always interesting to start with the implications first so that people have that in mind. So we have in the room and online a lot of people who are really leaders in the open government movement, transparent, accountable government. And for that group that we have here today, what are the one or two things that you're hoping they're going to do because of your book?
Well, I think there are one fundamental thing I think that one would want is, that I would invite, is to say we need a vision, and a big vision for what openness is about. And which I think both includes the work around kind of open data or open source or open stuff around government, but is much bigger. That if you really ask ourselves, why are the people in the room, what are they committed to? I think when people look at it, they want a society that really works for citizens around the world. They want a society that's free, that's fair, that's innovative, and that delivers the services that people want and need. And I think in that context, the message of the book then is very interesting in the sense of saying, well, how can we do that in a digital age? What are the policy choices we need to make? What are the choices we need to make as a society for that to happen? And also, I think in the other sense that many people in the room will know that for change to happen, for a better world to come, you need. It's not always simple. It's going to take a collective effort to enact change. And I think the other point then is the book offers a vision and a kind of approach around which one could say one can build a movement for change, for an open information age, and which is plausible, I think, politically and socially, but also exciting. So I think in that sense, it's kind of it's like zooming up one layer from maybe the everyday we have to look at the bigger picture of what's going on. And maybe then that's a little, actually make it very concrete. One of the things also that people deal with now would be the growth of digital monopolies, the growth of concentrations of power on the online world, which you might say, now Google and Facebook have the power to shift elections if they were to use that power. And I think that people interested in open government are ultimately interested in good governance. And that includes not just the government, but the power of other stakeholders and actors. So I think there's groups like ourselves should be deeply concerned with that there is not, these extraordinary concentrations of power and wealth in private hands in this way, not only because of its impact on innovation, but on its impact on governance and opportunity. So I think that's the other aspect, which is that we actually want to be concerned with those issues as well, very concretely. How can we have a world where we have the wonderful things like a great search engines or great social networks, but they are, if you like, provide democratic economic opportunity, but also in a sense a democratic society or a fair society.
Wonderful. And I really like that idea of this book helping to situate, those of us in the room maybe in this larger vision of openness. So it's not just open government, but what does an open society that really works for people look like? And I think we'll come back to that, especially in comments and thoughts at the end. But picking up on this problem that really opens the book. You diagnose this problem that there are giant corporations like Google and Amazon and Facebook that have a monopoly on our attention, and that means that, as you say, like there's the opportunity for them to really sway not just economic opportunity but political opportunity and things like that as well. And you attribute the problem, the fact that they have this monopoly on our attention, to three elements in the book. So platform effects, costless copying, and intellectual property rights. Can you maybe dive in a little bit more about what those three elements are and why you think they add up to the problem that we see today?
Yes, I mean, I think to start with, I'd start even with costless copying, because it shows up irrespective of what platform effects. I mean, platform effects exist sometimes, and just what I mean by platforms are places where you have some intermediary between two groups who want to interact. So Uber is a platform between people who want taxi rides and people who supply taxi rides. Google is a platform between people who want to find content, advertisers and content providers who want to search for things. So first of all, I think it's worth just stepping back for people and just you reflect for a moment. If someone came to you and said, well, what's the big change in the digital world? You can go out, you can look at Wired magazine. I mean, almost everywhere you look, I went to the subway, there's an advert for, the future of man and machine. Everywhere there's stuff about the kind of radical changes that digital technology is theory bringing. But if you were to say, what is the really fundamental change in a digital age? What is the fundamental development? And just pause and ask yourself, what is that? And maybe say, oh, everything's just getting faster, or everyone's on their phone, or whatever it is. But if you really distill it, there's one fundamental thing, at least in an economic sense, and that is costless copying. It is the fact that we're in a world, when we're moving into a world where most of what we produce and consume in terms of kind of economic value is information, and information can be infinitely copied, if you like, at almost zero cost. And that is the biggest change in the history of humanity's kind of economy. It's bigger than the agricultural revolution, it's bigger than the industrial revolution. It's a fundamental alteration. And I want to explain, though, that has a simple implication, which I call the apple farmer story. So imagine in the old world, we're apple farmers. We're in the old world of atoms, of physical things, of cars, of houses, of bread. And in that world, if we just imagine for the moment, simplest, we're apple farmers. I'm an apple farmer, you're an apple farmer, everyone in the room is an apple farmer. Well, we can grow apples and make a living. Some of us are better apple farmers than others. Maybe we earn a bit more, maybe you earn a bit less. Maybe some people are so bad they go out of business, some people grow. But that's basically a free market economy working just there. And then what happens is, imagine that one day, and it's a little like a fairy tale, a farmer arrives whose name is Mr. Gates. And Mr. Gates has a magical apple tree that can produce millions and millions and millions of apples. In fact, basically an unlimited number of apples every night at no cost to Mr. Gates. Well, what happens to the apple economy? Well, you go to one. Mr. Gates will supply everybody. He can undercut everyone's prices because he has apples at no additional cost. And so you end up with this concentration. And I think that's what's fundamental is, once you have costless copying, you have a tendency to one or a very few. And now you could have a world, this is the crucial additional part, where you could have the apple tree sort of owned by everyone, or you can have it owned by Mr. Gates. And remember, this is some kind of magical apple tree, or even more to be like it. It's like a world where not only he owns the apples, but any apple from his magical apple tree could be planted to become another magical apple tree, but you don't allow that. When we create intellectual property rights, we stop that. And we do that for a good reason, which is that in the real world, obviously, it would cost money for Mr. Gates to create the magical apple tree. Maybe he's been in his special apple tree lab for many years developing his magical apple tree. So we thought as a society, okay, we need some way to people to pay to create the apple tree in the first place. And that's where we came up with these monopoly rights. But what they lead to, combined with the cost of copying the monopoly rights, is this incredible concentration of wealth. And when you add in platform effects, it gets even worse. It gets even more that standardized, that thing. And so what we really need, what we need to say, well, is there an alternative? If that's the only way to pay for magical apple trees to get created, well, then that's life. We're just going to have to live with these monopolies, do our best I can, maybe regulate them a little bit when they get out of control. But we kind of have no choice but to live with them. But that is not the case. We have a way in which we can, if you like, share the abundance of this apple tree with everyone, the abundance of software, of music, of movies, the fact that we can, at the click of a button, share Windows or the latest song from Beyonce with the whole world, and pay those who invest time and energy and money in creating goods. We can have both. I mean, I'll come to that a little bit later, but what's crucial though, I think, just to recap, is that if you really want to be like provocative, the greatest causative factor behind Donald Trump's election, or the political instability we're seeing in the world today, whether you think it's good or bad, by the way, is simply the digital economy running on the old rules. Because it is that is driving inequality, that is driving the instability we see. So at the most basic level of our politics and of our economies and our fears about the robot future we have, it's a fear of a future owned by the 1%. And that doesn't really work for anyone, because it doesn't even really in the end work for the 1%, because it's unstable, but also it stifles innovation and other things. So I think to kind of wrap up what I say in that section of the book, is that not only is it bad in terms of inequality, we have a world where the 8 richest people own as much as half of humanity and 6 of the tech millionaires, but also you see Facebook buying WhatsApp, you see them buying Instagram, and that's not to stimulate innovation, it's to control it and channel it. So we also see this hidden cost in terms of innovation that we could have had.
Fantastic. So, and that's really what you're describing in the book is the closed world, the closed information world we live in. We've got this warlock with his magic apple tree, and it's both sort of concentrating wealth in a very unequal way, but also having these hidden costs around innovation. And then you make the call for an open world, which is really the revolution that you're looking for. So, to beat the metaphor to death, I suppose, what can you say a bit more about, in our apple farmer world, what the open revolution then looks like?
Right. So absolutely. And so in that world, and I think it's good that we can stick with the metaphor. I mean, what you want to think about, I like to say, is it's basically very simple what we can do, which I like to call it just simply 2-part payment versus 1-part payment. So at the moment, if you imagine Mr. Gates with his magical apple tree, if he were to give out the apples openly for anyone to use and then plant and create their own apple trees and so on, share more apples, he'd kind of put himself potentially out of business, because suddenly apples are free, basically. So we have this question of how do we pay? And the issue at the moment is Mr. Gates sort of only has one mechanism. He can charge for apples, that's it. And what you want to do is you want to create, just as there are, in a way, 2 costs with the apples. There's the cost of the tree, creating the tree, and then the cost of each new apple is basically 0. Just like in our digital world, there's a cost of coming up with the search algorithms, or coming up with the software, or writing the song, or making the movie. But then the cost of copies is very cheap. Is there a way we could pay for those 2 things separately? And the answer is yes. And the model, though imperfect, is to actually think of a real world one, which is Spotify. Spotify, in the old world of iTunes, the old days, we would pay per track, 99 cents a track. You can still do it if you want in certain places. But we moved to a world where basically tracks are free once you're a subscriber to Spotify. Each new track for you costs basically nothing, but you pay a subscription fee, a one fixed fee. So we want to kind of introduce that model systematically, where you pay for a subscription type fee for creation, and then you get access at the cost of kind of reproduction, which can be very low. And I just want to spell that out in an area you might not think of as the information economy immediately, because I think it gets people thinking, which is medicine. And it's also an example where, music, you could say, oh, well, it's people might not get access to music. That's not the end of the world. People not getting access to medicines is a life and death matter. And what you have today is that we have that problem with medicines. Medicines, although they are a physical pill, the vast cost of them is the R&D. And that is a model where we pay in two parts. We buy medicines at the actual cost of manufacture. So, for example, there's a drug called Sovaldi, a blockbuster drug in the United States for treating hepatitis C. In theory, it costs about $80,000 for a course of treatment. And as a result, states in the United States are going bankrupt trying to pay for this out of Medicaid. People can't afford it. But the actual cost of making that treatment is $100. The other $79,900 is going to pay for the R&D. Could we pay for those two things separately? So we say to kind of Gilead, who own it, here's a chunk of money. Here's as much money as you're getting today in subscription fees. And then let's have unlimited access to Sovaldi. And believe it or not, actually Australia, we have someone from Australia on the call, sort of have done that deal recently. They paid Gilead a one-off fee and then said, we're going to have unlimited access to this drug. And the question, what the book is proposing or inviting us to consider is, what would a world look like if we did that for all digital information, or movies, or music, or software? And how would we distribute the money out? Because I think the crucial point of what I've described, we don't want the government deciding what movies get created. We want the market determining how the money gets allocated to creators and innovators. And so I like to say this model, which I call remuneration rights, or Spotify, if you like, for the pharma industry. But remuneration rights is kind of, I sort of say, it's like capitalism and socialism sort of had a baby. You've got the free market aspect of freedom of enterprise, freedom of choice. Anyone can become an entrepreneur. Anyone can choose any song, any piece of software. That's now open. But you have that capitalist side, which is great, the free market side. But you also have the universal access, both for innovators and consumers.
Right. And I think that the skeptic would then say, like, okay, but is it just always government that's paying for that? And like, how does that really work? You have in another part of the book, you do a thought experiment about, like, what if the Netherlands went to this open model for music? And and you lay out there are actually different ways for how remuneration rights would work. So can you give us a little more detail, like who's paying and what does it end up looking like?
So in the sense, right, just to be clear about one thing, just for us to reflect in our mind, who pays today for all innovation? I mean, who ultimately pays for everything is us. There's no magical source of money out there. The question is, how do we sometimes pay for things? Do we pay for them through our taxes and then the government purchase them, or do we purchase them individually? And this one obviously is a little bit unusual, because what we're suggesting is that people will, in a way, get stuff, but just at the point of access at zero cost. They will still get music, they'll still get medicines. But what will happen is, obviously, if you're going to have it at zero cost, how do we collect the subscription payments? Now, you kind of roughly have two choices. One choice would be to have some monopoly corporate platform. Now, the issue with that is, it's like if Spotify is really successful, they'll end up treating the artists badly and treating the consumers badly. They'll raise prices or not give artists very much money and keep it for themselves. Have a for-profit entity collecting the money, then you have that challenge. So you really want the remuneration rights funds to be at least set up and funded by government through our taxes. However, it doesn't mean the government needs to be involved at all in the distribution. So you could have an open licensing fund for music, but the streaming system would still be run by Spotify. It would still be run by Deezer, whoever creates those platforms. The government doesn't need to get involved in the actual kind of building of technology and so on in that way. I mean, similarly in medicine, the government would set up a fund, or insurers, as they already do collect your money. They would put money in the fund, but it would then be distributed based on health benefits. What medicines were used, how much were they used? So the government would have no say in how the money got distributed. It would solely be responsible for us all paying our fair share, paying our subscription fees.
So I want to turn to, and I'm sure that there'll be more questions, to tease out the details of this when we turn things over to everyone participating. But I want to tease out some of the issues that I think are particularly relevant to the open government and transparency movement. And obviously, one of the big issues that's on everyone's mind these days is data misuse and privacy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you make very clear in the book that what you're talking about in terms of opening up information is non-private information. So, information that we currently think it's okay to buy and sell is really what we're talking about. But that line is pretty fuzzy. The government of Ontario, for example, is opening up the health records of 14 million residents to companies right now, anonymized, of course, but under an open revolution, how do you ensure data privacy and how do you deal with data misuse?
Well, so, you alluded, so in the book, there's a really clear definition of what information, like whether it's software or data, that we think of as being suitable, what would be made open. That information, which is already today, it's legal or legitimate to sell to anyone. And I emphasize anyone. It's not like it's legal or legitimate to give to your doctor, but it's legal or legitimate to give to anyone. So the book is focused on that. So the answer, in a sense, is we keep using the processes we have or that we need to develop. In a way, the question of how do we protect personal information is somewhat orthogonal. What I would say, and this is not so much in the book, but my general view, which is the kind of, for kind of information that, if I like it says, can be legally or legitimately sold or given to anyone, it should be open. But for information that's personal, that relates to you, that's private, I kind of think there's a flip side to the openness, which is like the same principles, but for you, which say you should be the one who gets to control and say what happens.
One second, we're just gonna mute one of our participants here, and we'll get back to your point, Rufus. All right, sorry, you were saying?
Yeah, so I think that basically that principle of for open data, which is for open information, shared with everyone, it's freedom for all to build on, share, and use. On personal data, it's you have freedom and control of who gets to use, build on, and share. I think that there's always going to be debates about the fuzzy line, and I think that's interesting. If I want to say something a little bit provocative about this,
please.
And I said in the book, I do think there's quite a divergence between ultimately those interested in the privacy question and those interested in what I would call, not necessarily divergence, there's commonality of interest, but between those interested, I guess, in power and wealth and creating a fair information economy and the privacy side. There's an overlap in that people want a fair deal. But for example, just to take a kind of classic thing, at the moment, many of the efforts that might lead Facebook to kind of be better about your privacy actually will undermine competition. Facebook right now, if they were being Machiavellian, which they might be, would actually be saying they might protest about the privacy stuff, but deep down they probably love it because it makes it actually harder for any other competitor to interoperate with them. Facebook could say, "Hey, you want to build a competitor and get data from the Facebook platform? You're not allowed to because privacy issues." So I think there's a fundamental thing. I think the overlap and the commonality of interest of the two groups would be, I would say that if we had an open Facebook, not of your data, but of the software, of the protocols, so that we could have competition. If Facebook could look like the internet, what would it have looked like? Well, there would have been a standard set of protocols for friending, and you'd have probably subscribed to your, just like you have a web hosting provider, you'd have had a social hosting provider who kept your profile, only shared it with the relevant people, hosted your content, but there would have been competition. I could have gone to any hosting provider and connected to OpenBook, the open social network, where basically, and there'd have been some people who provide you the social profile for free, but you have adverts, and some people you pay, just like with web hosting. And it would have been an open platform in that way. The thing I'm trying to say there, the commonality with the privacy side is that I think that competition or a lack of monopoly would lead to more choice and therefore more freedom for consumers to actually get a deal they want on privacy.
Fantastic. Well, and I think we welcome provocativeness. So I'm going to put everyone online and in the room on notice that it's going to be your turn to ask questions and be provocative in about 2 minutes. I do want to ask one final question, though, Rufus, that comes back around to the core problem that you outline at the very beginning of the book, which are these monopolies on attention. And I think that for the open government, open data folks, one challenge that we're running into is if you build it, they won't come at all. You can open up government information, and no one's paying attention. People aren't, using it to the degree that we would like, whether individuals or corporations. So do you think the open revolution is really going to help that, like help focus attention on away from these sort of monopolized platforms? Or in an open revolution, is everyone just going to use Facebook anyway?
Well, I don't know. So I think there's a question. So there's two parts to the question. So in the question of if you build it and they won't come, it depends. I always kind of wonder on this about like what our expectations or thoughts are. I mean, so one area that I think the open revolution relates to, I could just opine on in a separate, which is obviously I've been very involved in open data and open government data. And my view about some of that, which is the problem with the ecosystem, and wrote about 6, 7, 10 years ago, is that we've released lots of data, but the quality of much of this stuff is quite poor. If I'm really also honest, the UX, it's like, maybe pick this one example. Someone the other day said to me, OpenStreetMap, it's great, and it's obviously a huge success story, but why is it not more used? Well, I said, well, one blunt answer is the UX, on my mobile is pretty terrible, and Google can install it by default, Google Maps, onto 1 billion devices, and Apple have Apple Maps on the rest. So money matters. So one of the fundamental issues I also call at the moment, and I kind of go on about it a little bit in the book, I would say, is that traditional stuff, when we talk about open at the moment, I feel it's in this open ghetto. It's like we're trying to do open data, open source, with our kind of both our legs cut off and our arms cut off, and then going, hey, we're not very successful. I mean, the money relatively, the resource we have to invest in a lot of these projects is pitiful. And so as a result, for example, a lot of quality of government data, it's poor, it's not regularly updated, it's not consolidated. The apps that we build, if I'm honest, just, they're not hugely good, and that's partly about money. So one thing that really relates to the book is that it's saying, hey, we need money, and we need a sustainable way to fund open at scale, and that's remuneration rights. And I think that's one crucial answer to this community, is that the kind of amount of money we often have to build these applications is kind of peanuts relative to what commercial players would have. And if you want that to change, you need a new model that would be commercially oriented, and it would pay people who are successful, but it would have a level of scale, just at orders of magnitude different amounts of money in this. I mean, in a fully open world, all the money we're spending today would suddenly be available for open products. I mean, to summarize that at the end, and it's, I think I kind of trying to get out, is to say this is not about traditional open source in the book. It's about a new model. And I like to say that traditional open source is a bit like you're selling fries and ketchup, and you're giving away the fries and trying to make enough money on the ketchup to pay for the fries. It's a really tough model. And so I think we're very hampered by that. I think the second part, and this part is where I get to be philosophical on a different level, is that you've got to be realistic also about managing. I wrote a post in 2012 called Managing Expectations. It's like, we know for a long time that humans don't act on valuable information they have, that people don't change their minds. I remember for years trying to get my father to change the newspaper he read, and I still haven't succeeded after 30 years, despite even evidence about how unreliable the newspaper is and the bias, and that humans are tough to change their minds. And so I look back at the moment, at least, and we'll look at the open government movement and say the ROI, in my opinion, on a lot of it, is kind of extraordinary. In general, like I can just pick out loads of examples of apps that have been built, money that's been saved. But in terms of people using the stuff, it's also, what is our usage metric? If one journalist uses it and does something, it's kind of, I used to joke, which was the government in the UK, was someone say, oh, our data sets were only downloaded 15 times. But I said, but you got covered in The Guardian. They took one of your data sets and did something, and 2 million people looked at it. It's like, there's this challenge of measurement we also have in the area. But I think at a fundamental level, we should manage our expectations. Accountability part of the transparency and accountability is just really hard, and is a profound question about human government and collective action problems that no one solved, and no one probably will solve, because Arrow's impossibility theorem, among other things. But the question we ask is, are we getting reasonable return on this, some of the stuff we're doing? Is it cheap enough that it's worth it? So I think that would be my answer there. And in terms of the book, well, you do really want a different level of investment. And that's that takes a different model.
Fantastic. Well, I like this vision of giving the open government data movement its arms and legs back. That sounds useful. Let's go to questions. And so I'm going to zoom out and open this up to the room. And online, if you have a question, if you can just type like me into the box, into the chat box, then we'll be able to see your name and call on you and make sure that you have a moment to get heard. So please chat in the chat box if you'd like to ask a question online. And are there questions or comments in the room? Michael.
Thanks, Rufus. I have a million questions, but I'm going to limit it to two. One, sort of from the perspective of TAI and working with a group of funders. My sense is that while our members have supported openness, they were late to the game on thinking about ownership issues that you flag so strongly in the book. What would be the one recommendation to philanthropy around helping make this open revolution a reality? My second question is, maybe it's slightly unfair, but how much of this is relevant already in developing world contexts? We know the pervasiveness of social media for sure, but my sense is it maybe has implications in the way we think about leapfrog technologies, and that the open revolution could actually be a game changer, even more so in those contexts. Is that your take as well?
Great. So, I mean, one for funders, like, I mean, obviously, so maybe one is giving the one, it depends on the type of fund. I mean, one would be, this type of stuff is worth funding. So what I mean by that is kind of political change. I mean, ultimately, you want to change in the rules of the game for the information age, and it's worth investing in that effort and the research. So, for example, what would a model, just doing the white papers, like what would a model look like of remuneration rights for medicines in South Africa? What would it look like to do it for software in India? You know, what would these models look like? So that's one thing in funders, but more fundamentally, just the stakeholder engagement. You know, here's my thing. If you go to almost any government official, in my experience, you know, maybe over 45 and say, what's different about the digital age? They won't say it's that bits are different from bread and cost us copying. And that basic understanding, and you know, my experience last year, even talking with kind of expert funders in the medicines area, is the two-part payment model. The bits are different of bread and the two-part payment model. When it dawns on people, they're like, whoa, okay, like I suddenly get why steel is different. Like, why can I not do this for steel? I mean, just for a moment, many people kind of go, oh, but you know, if you try and do it for steel, like let's make steel free to car makers. Let's pay for steel, which is the input to medicines, you know, the R&D. Let's pay for steel, and then that will be free to car makers. Why is that not a good idea? Well, because it costs money to make more steel for more cars. It doesn't cost money to make more copies of the formula to put in the medicine. And so that's just that mental change. And it's just huge everywhere. Once you get it, like a lot of stuff kind of, it's like a shout switch, right? The second thing for funders, if I think, and this would be sexy, particularly for a big fund for someone, would be to say, listen, you know, I mean, I don't want to say, but there are examples where funders have put a significant amount of money sometimes in funds, and then they have this nightmare of grant-based funding. Right? You have to discharge the grant. It's complete pain to monitor. What happens if you were to say to people, let's go for a remuneration rights model? So you're going to put money in the fund. It will only fund open stuff, open software, or open, whatever you define the area to be. Let's say software in maybe this particular vertical, but we're going to pay on a demand base. We're going to distribute the money based on deployments of the software, modulo checking that people haven't hacked the system. You know, that would be a total game changer. And even for governments, I mean, government procurement is a nightmare. So I pitched this idea on software to a guy recently from a major government. I won't say exactly who. He was like so excited because like, I can basically get rid of all the hassle on procurement. I'm trying to get more open source, but it always has to go through procurement. It's a complete pain. I could create this fund with like 2% of the IT budget and then just say, you only pay for open stuff, and we track what got installed last year, and we give the money out to those guys. And you know, the analogy is always like the heartbleed bug. Everyone was using open SSL in government, but no one was paying for it to be maintained. Now suddenly you've got a way to pay for stuff that you actually use. So I think it could be a sexy model in a certain area. You could pilot it and say, let's do a $10 million fund for this kind of data or this kind of software or even these kind of reports. And we'll try and track as a pilot, you know, who actually installed this software system. I mean, we all know examples of software systems that got lots of money spent on them and were never deployed, right? So, you know, let's pay for people who build software systems that actually get used. And it suddenly means for the open guys, they've got a business model where they can actually have a sales team, all the stuff you actually need for software to work, a business development team, people to train people on their software, and it's open. On the second question, really quickly, developing world, absolutely. So for example, this could be a game, you know, you could have a game changer in terms of access to medicines with this model. In some places, and particularly I'd say here middle income at the moment, obviously really low income either aren't spending much on the R&D or they're actually got some deals that give them access to medicine at the moment. But if you're a middle income, even like India is going to be like, China's definitely middle income, or India, this is a big deal in terms of how you could run your medicine system or how you could run software. And I think it would also be a leapfrog in a way you're saying. Imagine a country adopted, it's suddenly got a huge advantage in homegrown innovation in that area. Suddenly it's way better to innovate. And I do want to emphasize one last point in this. If you're wondering, what's also super important about the model as it's designed is you can adopt remuneration rights incrementally. You don't need to get rid of like patents all over the world. You can replace patents selectively country by country. So you could say, hey, in, I don't know, let's pick in the Netherlands, I'm going to introduce remuneration rights to medicines. Everywhere else, you keep your patents, but in the Netherlands, you license your patents into the remuneration rights fund now. So you can deploy this incrementally on a pilot basis while keeping IP that's regime everywhere else, and even do it on a license-in model, so it's like politically feasible. The other crucial point I just want to mention here, and again, if it's not clear to people, is basically I've been involved in IP activism, and there's a general point that, you know, there's copyright debate in the EU right now. Copyright and patents, copyright certainly is probably overextended. But I always joke that my experience of trying, if you think of the rights holders, they're a big bear with a really juicy piece of meat. And trying to go up to the bear and say, hey, Mr. Bear, would you like to give me some of your meat? Or in fact, I'm going to take some of the meat from you, generally doesn't work very well. And I think it's almost hopeless as a model. And it also involves you in a negative dialogue about these things where you're fighting something. I think one of the great geniuses of the open, and I don't call it, but just the open government, open data movement when it happened, was it used to be called like access to information or, you know, public sector information, was we made it about something positive. It was about openness. It was about innovation. It wasn't just about transparency, it was innovation and transparency. And I think coming along here with remuneration rights, you're saying there's going to be as much meat on the table. So it's like we're coming up to the big bear and saying, hey, Mr. Bear, Mrs. Bear, will you like give me your big piece of meat? And I'm going to give you this huge fish in return. In the remuneration rights model, we as a society are going to put as much money on the table for the pharma industry, for the software industry as we have today. And they're going to even get the cash flows as a company are going to look the same. It's just you have a remuneration right rather than a monopoly right. And that's a huge deal in the sense of like why this has a hope of, you know, more than a hope, why this is going to make it. I mean, I believe, and I would bet money in my lifetime this will happen, because that's why Netflix is happening. It's why Spotify is even happening, even at the proprietary level of a platform. It's so attractive to do an all-you-can-eat subscription model. I mean, the New York Times 3 weeks ago was writing an editorial where they talk about a subscription model and compulsory license for medicine. The next day, the Cato Institute, of all things, wrote, so two guys that are coming out with a book about the health system where they say they agree with Bernie Sanders or not much, but they agree with him basically on a subscription model for medicines. There is real momentum on these models going forward because it's just so, there's so much value unlocked. People are dying out there. Voters, old voters, elderly voters, who a lot of them vote, are going to have to struggle to pay for their meds. And in this model, we can suddenly give unlimited access basically to medicine and pay the pharma industry as much money.
I love that. We're going to go to Anders, but I just want to encourage anyone online, if you have a question, to just flag that you have a question in the chat, and we'll come to you next. Anders?
So I wanted to get back to I have two quick questions. I wanted to get back to your point about taking your social media account multiple places, and like thinking about this also a little bit from like the activist and donor community, like what could that look like in practice? And what I've been thinking about, I mean, one thing that comes to mind is the portability of financial data within the EU. I mean, do you see a viable model where somebody go and ask the European Commission to say, go and ask some people to build an ISO standard for social media and then endorse that and force everyone to, like, what are the paths and who are the regulators involved? Then the other question I wanted to ask you about is, I mean, the big discussion on social media and in developing countries right now is Myanmar, where Facebook has really has been asleep at the wheel for 5 years, and there's really been like very significant consequences around hate speech. They haven't acted fast enough. And I think one of the things that's interesting is we're almost seeing this slow dependent path of civil society going and asking Facebook to be more accountable, to hire more Myanmar staff. Facebook promises to hire 10,000 people, and suddenly we have a global Aetna that's this like thousands of staff. They don't solve the fundamental problem, which is monopoly. And I guess my question is on that, like, what's the advocacy ask for us to avoid having sort of just a system, an organization that gets bigger and bigger, but doesn't solve the fundamental problem?
Well, I just think it's a brilliant question. As with my position, really great question. Thank you. Really insightful. I think what you're getting to, just maybe go in reverse. What's so interesting is you're basically turning Facebook into this global media, like the biggest media organization with 2 billion users, and then you're saying to them, hey, why don't you become editorial too, to an extent, and I think it's kind of in a, when you think about it, it's sort of insane what's going on in that way, because what you're trying to get to there in a good way is, and I don't think, by the way, I want to say here that Facebook's got any bad, I don't think Zuckerberg, other than desire to make lots of money, or which is, he's got a duty to his shareholders to an extent, I don't think he's in any way.
Thanks for coming.
Or whatever. Am I back?
Yes. You don't think Zuckerberg is in any way...
Like I said, I don't think he's got, he's a bad actor. He's not currently using Facebook to manipulate public opinion or anything. It's kind of insane. We have a world where we're allowing one for-profit company to have that level of power. And I think that's what you're allowing. So the answer is, one option is the regulatory option at the moment. The irony is, I always think that's like shutting the door after the horse has bolted. It's like you'll kind of turn Facebook into this, like the AT&T of the 21st century, but it's kind of like, but it's a global, it's not even a national company. I mean, it's like, that's why the open is really has to be the solution. Your real ask to Facebook would be open up all the protocols, open the software, we'll pay you money, and in particular, innovation, we've got the remuneration rights. In the near term, what we're probably going to get is going in that direction of regulation. But it's going to be a really weird world because you're trying to regulate a global entity on a national basis. That's the beauty about, I kind of keep going, is that I could describe myself as a weird combination, right? Like I've got the free market part of me and I've got the universal openness part. And that's, traditionally those were always, that's what I say is so weird about the digital world. Suddenly these two things can come together. And that's my part about a globally regulated Facebook. The free market part of me is just completely offended by it because it's like, no, with openness, we can have decentralized innovation, we can have proper regulation on a national basis. That's the only real way out of what you were describing. You've got, because otherwise you have international government committee deciding how Facebook's interoperability protocols are going to work on a year-by-year basis. Every time they try and innovate, we're going to be like, are you excluding competitors in some way by doing this? It's just going to be insane. And it's going to take, by the time it happens in 20 years' time, it will have all moved on and we'll have the next monopoly. So that's why openness really, kind of back to the free market, it's what really allows decentralized innovation, decentralized regulation, even decentralized freedom of choice for people about what goes on. It's really the only kind of path over the mountain.
Fantastic. And we're gonna close out with 2 questions from online, and we'll take both the questions and then let Rufus have a final say. So, Cal, can you ask your question first?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Rufus, for this. This has been amazing. I'm really fascinated by the market-based approaches that you're talking about, these new models. I'm interested in your thoughts around digital citizens, because we're moving towards a real revolution and we've got concentration of power at the moment. What kind of identity and knowledge do we need to have as digital citizens? And I'm coming from perspective, working with a lot of social entrepreneurs that want to teach young people how to code, teach senior citizens how to code, as just one example. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are around, as a population, how we need to view ourselves as digital citizens if we're going to move towards an open revolution.
Fantastic question. And just before you take that, Rufus, let's get the question from Laura as well. Laura, do you want to ask?
I was about to say that. Great idea. 2 questions at once.
Sure. So thanks for the talk. And I found one of the things I find most challenging in the book was the arguments around things like medicine are very clear, but I find it much harder to really see how we go about making change on some of the social media and kind of internet platform questions that we've touched on. That's a space where policy people, certainly here in the UK, are desperate for very concrete ways forward. And I'm still not really clear what the ask is there. What we should be, what is the thing we say about internet issues? Everyone agrees Facebook's terrible. But what is the next step to start to move on the open revolution on that? And sort of a secondary question is, you're sort of mixing up the open movement and what you've described as the IP activism community. I have no idea where I would go find the IP activism community if I was going to get involved in that. So where do those guys and girls hang out, right? Where do we go if we want to get involved?
Yeah, great questions, Laura. So quickly in order, on the digital citizens, Cal, the one thing I'd say that I think is fascinating about a lot of this is we always think stuff's new, particularly today. But a lot of the challenges are age old, right? We have apps, but democracy has the same problems as in ancient Athens. There was fake news then, there were demagogues, there was populism, there a lot of the questions, a lot of the hard and interesting problems about our world don't really go away. I mean, I just posted a link to the kind of Ubernomics, a piece that I wrote in the chat, where the people, I went around over the last 2 years, going around talking about these ideas, and a lot of people talking about how to regulate Uber and platforms. They're like, it's so new, isn't it? So new. And I was like, not really. We've had marketplaces for thousands of years. The economics and the social dynamics of stock exchanges and marketplaces and Uber are really, really similar. So maybe, Cal, one thing I think that's interesting is learning to code is awesome. I think it's fantastic, and it introduces you to the magic of costless copy. That moment when you create something and you can share it all with everyone on the internet, it's just an extraordinary moment, I think, for people. Like, it really is magical. But I think also people just getting present to, hey, maybe the basic economics of the digital age, like, hey, costless copying is just like 101. How do platforms work? The dynamics of platforms. I think actually really that would be what digital citizens need rather than coding skills to some extent. Learning to code is certainly very useful and will be in more and more demand. But a basic understanding as a citizen of how the digital economy will work and why it's different, I think would be more important. To come then to Laura's point, so what concrete actions, Laura? I think it's a great one. And I want to write up a piece on, there's the Ubernomics piece, but kind of how would you apply remuneration rights to X? And the answer, so then what would you do right now what would I do right now with social media? I think what you'd want to play for is to actually say, for Facebook, if I could rage your magic wand, you'd be saying, let's go for the interoperability on AP, like let's standardize the core protocols like we did with TCP/IP and enforce interoperability. That would be a first step to then setting up a remuneration rights fund that could fund new innovation. But I think you'd go down that route. For search algorithms, if you really want a blue sky, let's set up a remuneration rights fund for search algorithms. So just kind of walk with me, play with me here. How would we do open search? How would we get rid of the Google monopoly, if you like, and have something where Google still exists, but it's just competitive. It's a competitive market. Well, we'd set up a big fund. We'd say, well, how much is Google making today? how much of it will still someone will still make in advertising, and how much of that cost is running all the data centers. And think of Google as two parts here, and this helps to go through the idea of it. Google has a core information part, the algorithms, the databases of street names, not the personal data, but just all the other data, and the software that runs that. And then they've got loads of search reliability engineers who stay up late with beepers. They have, lots of data centers. That's rival stuff. That's stuff that isn't information in a way. It's stuff we want to pay for. You want to separate those things. You want to create a remuneration rights fund. You say to Google, from now on, all search algorithms will be open. All the related software is open. We have this big fund, $10 billion a year or $20 billion, that pays people who create new search algorithms. And you get paid based on how much your algorithm is used by the search engines. The two things now get separated. People actually run the software service, the SaaS. It's like people can host, there's like WordPress, the software, the search algorithm, and then you've got WordPress, the service. The search engine service and the algorithm are separated. You have a remuneration right fund for the algorithm part, and anyone can run a search engine service and have advertising on it if they want, or have a subscription model or whatever they like to pay for that service. That's the two parts. That's what you could actually be putting out there. Now, it's a radical move, and you could start in the UK with just saying, hey, let's fund a $50 million fund for open search algorithms that will, starting from now, it's not as exciting. But that's the kind of thing, Laura. And then finally you're saying, who do we reach with this? So I want to kind of end, it's a great thing to end on. Basically, I think we need to build a movement. And the analogy, if you got to the end of the book, is the environmental movement. At one point, there were different people who got upset about parks, and some people got upset about maybe some air pollution, but they were disparate people. They wouldn't have even called themselves environmentalists. And at some point, they started to see themselves as part of a consistent movement. They might still have different interests. Some people care about air pollution. Some people care about fishing. Some people care about this. But they're environmentalists. They have a common kind of, maybe some degree of common vision, some degree of common language, the word green, the word sustainable. At the moment, if you go down the street and say, we want an open world, no one would know on what on earth you're talking about. We want to play, one of the things is that we get a world, and to get that, you need to start with a movement. And it starts small, but you need to start with also some degree of common vision. I think a basic, I'm offering it, is to say, an open world is one in which all public, all non-personal information, all software, all movies, or music is open, and creators and innovators get paid fairly. And that is a world that we stand for, and you need to build a movement. And I think one of the things at the moment is that alliance can go well beyond the current tech community. In fact, it must do. And I think a good example today was I talked with someone, senior political person in the UK, and there's just been a report out on economic justice, on inequality. And it's on inequality, and it's very broad, but right in the heart of that report is internet monopolies. And I think building that coalition out, seeing this is a renewal moment. If you think of where we've come from and how much we've achieved in the last 10 years, despite maybe there are disappointments, but in transparency and accountability, relatively, sometimes you can look at these things and think, wow, we're certainly on the open data. But the next stage, I think, is to broaden this and connect and see this as part of a movement to enact kind of a decent digital economy. And a digital economy works for everyone. And that's because the digital economy is going to be the whole of the economy. So that's the point, is kind of join the movement. And to Laura's question, I think right now there's no clear place, but I think we need to get together as a kind of, whoever's interested, and if you're interested, you can email me at hello@openrevolution.net. And, we start with probably a leaders program. We start with the convening. What is our manifesto? What is our constitutional convention of this kind of movement? And it's a thing that will take some time. But I think we're like the environmental movement in 1962. We're right at the beginning, and it's so exciting because I promise you, right now, no one mentioned digital economy and inequality with regard to the Trump election. They talked about Cambridge Analytica, they talked about Twitter, they didn't talk about the big story. But I promise you, 5-10 years now, that's the big story. It's coming. You see it in academia. People are starting to really focus on this. It is coming. And it's now is the chance to kind of make a difference to that.
Fantastic. I think there's a class in the room. I think that is a perfect note to end on. Rufus, can you put that email address into the chat so that everyone has it? And I just love how this conversation has both touched on the sort of the nitty-gritty, near-term tactics that we might take, and then also this really big common vision that we might adopt. And I think that's just fantastic. So thank you to all of you for participating. Thank you, Rufus, so much for both writing the book and being willing to talk to us about it so compellingly. And I really just highly encourage people to both get in touch with Rufus, and also maybe we can put a TAI email in the chat as well, but also TAI, who's doing great work in this realm.
And also, just to say on that, read. The book is open. You can both buy it on Amazon, and it's open and free as PDF EPUB online. There is openrevolution.net.
I have it pulled up. I was reading it during your talk.
Got it, and you can do pay what feels right. So, as I said, we don't have remuneration rights yet, but really the biggest thing I ask, and I do ask at the end of these things, so once this, obviously, please read and share the book and the ideas, but most of all the ideas. So if you get to talk to one person, and particularly someone today in the next few days who isn't in this area, maybe it's your mother, maybe it's your sister, maybe it's your brother, maybe it's some work colleague elsewhere, and share with them, hey, what's different about digital age? It's cost us copying, and work them through the Apple story or whatever it is, but just start getting people thinking. That is incredible, because that's how we share this. When people start going, oh yeah, there is something different about this, and there's this connection to why is the middle class getting hollowed out? Why do I worry about my job security? That connection, that's incredible. So please share the ideas most of all. That's with one person the next few days. That's my invitation.
Wonderful. A great call to action. Fantastic. Thank you everyone so much. And with that,
Thank you so much, and Michael, particularly for putting this together. A huge thank you to you guys, and brilliant sharing. And for everyone who showed up, thank you so much. I really want to say something. It's like, sometimes, it's like, it takes energy. It really touches me every time I come on these things. The questions people ask, it inspires one that this is worth, it's like, a world worth fighting for. So thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely. Thanks, thank you all so much. All right, everyone. So long.
Thank you, Megan. It was
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you for coming.
And Ava, normally what we do too is